anyone who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new. Albert Einstein. These words are an important reminder that risking mistakes is a natural and necessary part of any type of learning. Our names are Jennifer Albuja and Mario Rodas, and today we proudly present our master's dissertation, exploring the effects of literature circles on EFL speaking skills, an action research study in an A1 multilingual classroom.
This research was conducted at a public university in the Ecuadorian Amazon region and focuses on helping beginner students develop the confidence and ability to speak, which is one of the biggest challenges in English language teaching. Throughout this presentation, we will explain why we conducted the study, how we implemented literature circles in the classroom, what results we obtained, and what these findings may contribute to teaching English as a foreign language.
Our presentation is split as follows. First, we'll introduce the context and explain the educational problem that motivated this research. Next, we'll review the theoretical foundations and previous literature. After that, research design and methodology, followed by the findings and what they mean. Finally, we conclude with the main implications, limitations, and recommendations of the study.
This brings us to our introduction and context section. Speaking is widely considered one of the most difficult skills to develop in a foreign language. But unlike reading or listening, speaking requires students to produce language immediately, and often while dealing with limited vocabulary, grammatical rules, and fear of making mistakes.
Research has also shown that foreign language anxiety reduces the willingness to participate in class. There are many learners who stay quiet through the class not because they don't know anything, but because they lack confidence.
This situation is especially relevant in Ecuador, where national English proficiency levels continue to be relatively low, according to the 2021 Education First English Proficiency Index. As teachers, we frequently observe classrooms in which students understand much more than they're willing to say. So why does this matter? Speaking is the skill that reflects language construction and that allows learners to actually communicate. It is something that is meaningful beyond grammar.
For universities, this is an important challenge because students need English for academic reasons, but also increasingly more in professional and international contexts. But many classrooms still rely heavily on teacher-centered instruction, where students spend much more time listening than speaking. This shows the need for instructional strategies that involve learners and provide opportunities for authentic verbal interaction. This led us to the literature review. So, what are literature circles? Now that we established the problem, I'd like to introduce to you the main strategies investigated in this study. Literature circles. These are simply small discussion groups led and directed by students in which everyone reads the same text and then meets to discuss it in a collaborative way.
This is different from traditional reading activities where students simply answer comprehension questions. What literature circles do is transform reading into a social experience where students exchange opinions, ask questions, explain ideas, and respond to one another.
An important characteristic is that every student has a specific discussion role, ensuring that participation is shared rather than dominated by one or two people. Previous research has shown that literature circles do promote collaborative learning, communication, autonomy, and increase classroom engagement.
As we said before, one of the defining characteristics of literature circles is role-based interaction. So instead of having students participate freely with no guidance, each learner receives a specific responsibility during the discussion.
For example, one student summarizes the chapter, another asks discussion questions, another one connects the story with personal experiences, and other students could focus on vocabulary or maybe predicts future events.
These roles help distribute responsibility among all group members and encourage balanced participation.
According to previous research, this type of structure reduces teacher dominance and creates more opportunities for every student to contribute meaningfully for the discussion.
That brings us to our other dimension of collaborative learning. Collaborative learning emphasizes that students learn not only from the teacher, but also from one another. During discussion, learners negotiate meaning, they clarify ideas, they respond to classmates, and they solve communication problems together.
However, research also points out that collaboration is not automatically effective. Without sufficient structure, some students could dominate the conversation while others stay quiet. Literature circles attempt to overcome this limitation by combining collaboration with, with clearly defined discussion roles.
Our study is based on two complementary theoretical frameworks. The first is Vygotsky's social cultural theory, which argues that learning develops through social interaction. This is essential to the concept of literature circles because this perspective suggests that students construct knowledge while interacting with peers and with teachers. Through scaffolding and support within the zone of proximal development, learners gradually become capable of doing tasks independently.
The second framework is communicative language teaching, or CLT. It says meaningful communication is more important than memorizing grammar rules in isolation, and it is to use language for authentic communication.
Together, these theories suggest that regular interaction is essential to develop speaking ability, which is precisely what literature circles are based on.
Before explaining the study in detail, I'd like to highlight the four key authors who informed this research. Hardy Gold emphasized that literature circles promote authentic communication through structured discussions. Revuelta Moda and Alvarez highlight how collaborative reading fosters learner autonomy, confidence, and interaction. And Espinosa Ceballos and colleagues demonstrate that literature circles increase participation and engagement in EFL classrooms. Finally, Mira and colleagues explain how speaking anxiety can reduce students' willingness to communication. Together, these authors provide a theoretical and empirical foundation for investigating how literature circles may improve speaking fluency and verbal participation. With those concepts in mind, we pose the following research question. To what extent do literature circles affect speaking skills among level 1 EFL students?
So this leads us to the issue of speaking ability. Speaking ability is a broad concept that includes pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, interaction, and fluency. In this study, however, we focus specifically on speaking performance.
Another focus of our observation in this study was verbal participation. While fluency refers to how smoothly students speak, verbal participation refers to how often and how willingly they engage in classroom communication.
This includes behaviors such as volunteering ideas, initiating conversations, responding to classmates, and just keeping the flow of communication going.
For example, a student may participate often without being completely fluent, just as another student may have good language knowledge but doesn't contribute very often. Because of this distinction, we treat speaking development and participation as two separate but related dimensions of speaking development.
This brings us to our section of research design and methodology. So, how is our study different from previous ones? Even though literature circles have been widely studied in education of English, most of the research has focused on outcomes such as reading comprehension, vocabulary development, motivation, or collaborative learning, but it is still a limited focus that has been given to the impact of literature circles on speaking performance and verbal participation.
And Particularly in Ecuador, there is limited research conducted in EFL classrooms in universities. The gap in the literature is what motivated our study and led us to investigate whether literature circles could be an effective strategy to improve these points.
So with that in mind, our general objective has been the following: to determine the effects of literature circles on the speaking skills of A1 multilingual university students.
And more specifically, we sought to measure speaking performance before and after the intervention in implementing 9 literature circles as a strategy to verbal interaction, to compare speaking performance before and after, and finally explore perceptions of literature circles and its influence on participation.
To answer these research objectives, we adopted an explanatory, sequential, mixed methods action research design. This allowed us to begin by collecting quantitative data through speaking assessments and surveys, and then complement those results with qualitative evidence from classroom observation and interviews.
Action research was particularly appropriate because the study was carried out within our own teaching context, with the goal of improving classroom practice and simultaneously generate research findings. So, by integrating both numerical and descriptive data, we were able to obtain a richer understanding of the effects of the intervention.
Therefore, our sample involved 65 undergraduate students enrolled in Level 1 English courses at a public university in the Ecuadorian Amazon. The participants represented 3 existing classes that were selected through convenience sampling, which allowed us to implement the intervention in an authentic educational setting while maintaining the normal classroom environment.
Here we summarize the overall procedure followed by the study. We began by administering a speaking pretest to establish a student initial level of speaking performance, and next, students participate in the literature circle intervention, which consisted of 9 sessions of 1 hour each, conducted over a 3-week period.
During these sessions, we did classroom observations to document students' participation and interaction. After the intervention, the same speaking assessment was administered as a post-test to measure any changes in performance. Students then completed a perception survey, and they also participated in semi-structured interviews to share their experiences regarding the intervention.
And finally, we triangulated the quantitative and qualitative findings, and in this way compared evidence from various sources for a full interpretation of the results. Our book for this session was an adapted version of the novel Anne of the Green Gables by Oxford Bookworms. A key feature of the intervention was that the students took responsibility for leading the discussions. Each participant was assigned a discussion role, such as summarizer, discussion leader, connector, or vocabulary finder. And these roles rotated through the interventions so that everyone experienced different communicative responsibilities.
Therefore, rather than directing every discussion, the teacher acted mainly as a facilitator by providing guidance, by monitoring participation, and generally giving support. This is what allowed students to interact more actively among themselves. As for instruments, to evaluate the intervention, we collected information using 4 complementary instruments. The speaking assessment measured students' verbal performance before and after the intervention. Then classroom observations documented participation and interaction.
We also use a perception survey that gathered the students' opinions regarding the activities, while semi-structured interviews got to get insight into their experiences.
As for the reliability of these instruments, we disclaim the following. The speaking pre and post test is an adaptation of the interchange in passages placement test, the speaking conversation test section by Cambridge University Press. Also, the survey done in Likert scale, observation checklist, and semi-structured interview were adapted from those used by Espinosa et al. And finally, instruments were reviewed and approved by the panel of reviewers of US.
We'd like to explain more deep our speaking assessment to determine the student's initial speaking level. We use the placement conversation from the Interchange of Passages placement testing program. This is a 10-minute individual speaking interview and follows an adaptive format, meaning the examiner adjusts the difficulty of the questions based on each student's responses. Students are evaluated using the official rating form, which produces a holistic speaking score on a scale from 1 to 12. We administered the same assessment before and after the literature circle intervention. To ensure a consistent comparison of students' speaking performance, after that, collecting data, we analyze the quantitative and qualitative information separately before integrating the findings. For the quantitative data, we calculated descriptive statistics and used JABS software to perform a Wilcoxon sign rank test, which allow us to compare the students' pre-test and post-test speaking scores.
Whereas for the qualitative data, we conducted a thematic analysis of the classroom observation notes, open-ended survey responses, and interview transcripts to identify recurring themes in the answers of students. And finally, we triangulated both data sources, which allowed us to compare evidence from multiple instruments and develop a more comprehensive and reliable interpretation of our results.
It led us to the findings and discussions. Before implementing the literature circles, we established a baseline students' speaking performance through the pre-test. The students included 65 university students with beginners English proficiency, as shown on the slide. 40% of the students were classified in the A1 level and 60% at A2 level, while none of the students reached the B1 level.
These results confirmed that the participants began the study with relatively low speaking proficiency and provided a clear point of comparison for evaluating the impact of the intervention. So after the 9 literature circle sessions, students completed exactly the same speaking assessment as before. It's visible here that the average speaking score increased from 2.72 to 4.26, representing an average improvement of 1.54 points. The box plot also shows that the entire distribution shifted upward, meaning that improvement was observed in most of the class, not only a few students.
And these descriptive statistics suggest that the students generally perform better after participating in the intervention. Now, was the improvement significant? Observing higher averages is not enough to determine this. We also wanted to determine whether these improvements were statistically significant. So, through a Wilcoxon sign rank test, we show a probability value lower than 0.001, indicating that the improvement was highly significant and very unlikely to have occurred by chance. In addition, almost 88% of the students improved their speaking score, with only one student getting a lower score after the intervention.
Put together, these findings strongly suggest that literature circles did have a positive effect on students' speaking performance. Beyond the numerical scores, we also examined how students changed between CEFR equivalent speaking levels. Prior to the intervention, no student had reached the B1 level. However, after the intervention, nearly 37% of the participants displayed speaking skills within the B1 level.
At the same time, the proportion of students remaining at the A1 level decreased considerably. This upward movement across proficiency levels provide additional evidence that the students' oral performance improved through the intervention.
We disclaim that these levels are mostly referential and they are subject only to the parameters of this specific assessment by the Interchange and Passages program. Aside from speaking performance, We also wanted to understand the experience that students had with the literature circle activities. Overall, the perceptions were positive in four main areas. They felt that their speaking became more fluent. They learned useful vocabulary from classmates and readings. They felt bigger confidence in speaking English, and they felt that the activities encouraged bigger classroom participation.
This perception complements the quantitative findings by showing how students themselves experience the intervention. The classroom observations also help us understand what happened during the intervention itself. Across the 9 sessions, we saw students gradually becoming more willing to participate in the discussions. They relied less on the teacher and interacted more frequently with classmates. Instead of waiting for the teacher instructions, students held conversations within their own groups. These observations support the survey findings by showing visible changes in classroom behavior throughout the intervention.
Finally, we also conducted interviews for insight into students' experiences. Many participants did explain that discussing the story in small groups made them feel more comfortable speaking English. They also described how the discussion roles encouraged everyone to contribute, which reduced the pressure of participating in the group.
Several students mentioned that vocabulary learning occurred naturally during the discussion because they constantly exchange ideas with classmates. Overall, the interviews help explain why students' speaking performance improved during the intervention.
So, after examining all the evidence together, we conclude that literature circles did create regular opportunities for meaningful oral communication. Rather than completing isolated speaking exercises, students repeatedly interacted with classmates in authentic discussions about the book they were reading.
This continuous practice seems to have increased both confidence and their willingness to communicate, which is what likely contributed to the improvements observed in the speaking achievements.
These findings are consistent with previous research. Earlier studies, such as Revuelta Muela, Tanya Mina, and Hardy Gold, suggested that literature circles promote collaboration, learner autonomy, and meaningful communication. However, our findings support these conclusions too, but they also extend the existing literature by demonstrating a measurable improvement in speaking performance within an Ecuadorian university context.
But why did the students improve? There are several factors that may be the reason. First, the rotating discussions roles ensure that every student had a clear responsibility during each session. And second, the peer interaction provided continuous opportunities to practice the speaking skills. Finally, third, the collaborative environment reflected Vygotsky concept and scaffolding where students support one another learning.
And then there's the strong possibility that the discussions created a less stressful environment than the traditional teacher-centered speaking activities, which is what encouraged free participation. One of the main contributions of this study is that it addresses an important gap in the literature. Previous research on literature circles, as we already expressed, focused mainly on reading comprehension. In contrast, our study examined overall speaking skills and verbal participation using a mixed methods design, particularly in an Ecuadorian setting.
This provides additional evidence that literature circles can support oral language development, not only reading. Now we go to the conclusions. Well, in conclusion, the results indicate that literature circles can represent an effective strategy for promoting speaking development among beginner EFL university students. Students also improve their overall speaking performance by participating more actively in classroom discussions and reported greater confidence when speaking English. Both the quantitative and the qualitative findings point toward the same conclusion, that collaborative discussion can create opportunities for meaningful language practice. Now, let's talk about the limitations of the study. Like any educational study, this research also has some limitations. The participants came from only one public university. The sample was selected through convenience sample, which limits how broadly the findings can be generalized.
And in addition, the intervention lasted only 3 weeks. So a longer implementation might produce different results. Finally, because there was no control group, improvements cannot be attributed exclusively to the literature circles without caution. So based on these findings, we recommend that EFL teachers consider incorporating literature circles as part of the regular speaking instruction, particularly in beginner level classes. Universities can also promote collaborative learning strategies that encourage authentic communication among students.
Finally, future research could replicate this study with larger samples, longer interventions, and additional measures of speaking performance, such as pronunciation and interactional competence. These steps will help strengthen the evidence regarding the effectiveness of literature circles in different educational contexts. Thank you so much for your attention.